Hello friends, welcome back to Haas of Props. Are you as excited for the premiere of The Knight of the Seven Kingdoms as I am? The story has to be my favorite from Westeros. I've read the book, the trade paperbacks. In fact, the other year I made a dragon helmet inspired by one from the trade paperback. This version of Westeros reminds me of a smash-up of a Renaissance fair and medieval times, and I'm looking forward to see what the studio does to bring Duncan Egg to life on the screen. And to commemorate the debut, I wanted to make something from the series, and what could be more perfect than Duncan's sword he inherits from Sir Arlen. It's 3D printed, and to assemble it, I've used a couple of new techniques. So let's head to the shop, let me show you what I mean, and let's get started. The sword is made of 7 pieces. I have 8 here because I split the guard into 2 for easier printing. Even though the piece is printed really clean, I still want to prep them in order to remove any signs of print lines, and to begin that, I'm using a 180 grit pad on a hand sander. Then I switch to some 220 and sand again by hand. This keeps the pieces from overheating and warping. You'll notice the side on the left, which has received the 2 passes, is cleaner than the side on the right, which has only received the 180. This is why multiple grits pay off. Okay, all the pieces are sanded, and as the support, I'm going to use this piece of 1/4-inch steel rod. This will keep the sword rigid and give it a little bit more weight. And to glue the rod in place, I'm using Kwik Weld steel enforced epoxy. I haven't used this for a project like this, so let's see how it turns out. You'll want to try and squeeze out equal parts. I found it better to use 2 fingers to push the plunger because the lighter tube is thicker and doesn't shift as easily and evenly if you just try to push with your thumb. Then once you have enough, pull the plunger back a little bit to relieve some of the pressure so the tips won't continue to ooze, and make sure to put the cap back on. Now the 2 separate parts need to be mixed together until the color is even. I'm using a chopstick because I'll end up using it again in the assembly in a minute, but a putty knife or a popsicle stick would work just as well. Once all mixed, I take the first piece of the blade and the covered chopstick and scrape off the epoxy into the hole. This stuff can set in about 6 minutes, so you'll want to work fast. I repeat the process with the second blade piece, trying to make sure plenty of the epoxy is coating the inside of the hole, and then the 2 blade pieces can be slid onto the rod. While I finish this up, I would really appreciate it if you would click the subscribe button if you haven't already. It's completely free to you and will help my channel grow. Plus, if you click the notification bell, you can customize your notifications so you never miss a project. Thank you. Alright, so the pieces are on the rod, but before pressing them together, I'm putting a little bit of CA glue where they will touch. This will hold them in place and allow me to continue building before the epoxy hardens. Once I'm happy with the alignment, I cure the CA glue instantly with a couple of drops of Zip Kicker, wipe away any excess glue, and continue with the other 2 blade pieces. I've already attached the handguard in the same manner, and now it's time for the grip. This can be slid on... Oh, wait, almost forgot. First, the epoxy. This time, I'm spreading it onto the rod, and then slide the grip onto it. Spinning the grip will spread the epoxy on the inside, and then it can be glued in place with the CA glue. The pommel slides onto the end and receives both the epoxy and the CA glue. Now, I will let this set overnight to make sure the epoxy on the inside is completely cured before continuing with the finishing process. Alright, it's the next morning, the epoxy is rock hard, and now I'm taking the hand sander and running over the seams on the blade where some epoxy and CA glue squeezed out a little bit. The best thing about these 2 adhesives is they are both sandable when they're cured. Up next, I'm using this glazing and spot putty to make sure the seams are completely filled. Since I'm not wearing gloves, I'm using this palette knife to smear the putty into and over the seams. I always apply it on thick because it's acetone based and it shrinks slightly as it dries, which means if it's too thin, the seams can potentially open back up. After that dried, I smooth the spots with a hand sander, and now we can prep the rest of the surface. For that, I'm using this mixture of spot putty and acetone. This can be brushed onto the entire sword surface, and make sure you use an old brush. I also like to lay down a scrap piece of paper because this step can be pretty messy. Then I smooth the surface with some 400 grit. By applying the mixture, it'll fill in any fine lines in the print that sanding did not remove. You might not be able to feel them or see them, but you'll notice them as soon as you start to paint. The entire sword is sanded and feels smooth. It's at this point I like to spray the sword with a 2-in-1 filler and sandable primer. This helps even off the surface, and since it's sandable, it can be applied thickly. Any runs or drips will be removed in the following steps, but I like to give my projects 2 layers at the minimum, and I like to let the first sit for 30 minutes before applying the second. Once the primer is fully dried and cured, I'm going to sand it with the 400 grit. This will even off the surface and remove any drips and runs that may have occurred. Now, since I want the blade to be smooth like glass, I'm going to wet sand it with some 1000 grit. And to do that, I dip the paper into the water and then polish up the blade. This will make the surface so smooth it's crazy. And this process creates a sludge, so you'll want a soft cloth nearby so that you can wipe it away periodically and check the progress as you go. Okay, now with the primer layer all smooth and dry, we can begin the painting process. I'm going to base the blade in this gloss black. Since I want the blade to be shiny and metal looking, a gloss black is always the best place to start. And for the handle, I'm going to base it with this matte black since nothing at this end needs to be shiny. And in order to avoid runs and drips at this stage, I'm going to build up layers of paint by spraying 4 to 5 thin coats in order to get even coverage. I've let the sword sit overnight to make sure the base spray is fully cured under the surface. I'm going to start by painting the handle. For the guard and the pommel, I'm taking some metallic tin and adding some black and mix until I get a color that looks like a graphite steel. Once I'm happy with the color, I thickly brush it onto the pommel and guard. Then I use a makeup sponge and pounce the paint in order to blend out the brush marks and leave this texture behind. I'm going to let this layer dry before proceeding because I want to keep this texture and not blend it away. Next up, I take this light silver and mix some of it into the graphite color to lighten it slightly. Then I apply this to some spots of the dry graphite color and blend it with the sponge. This will create some subtle variation in the coloring, making the sword look more realistic since things are never truly one color. After that is dry, I take some of the black, thin it with some water, and brush it around the pommel accents. Then really blend it with the sponge. This again just adds some more variation and depth to the paint. Next, I've taken some chestnut and mixed it with some burnt umber and thin it with some water. I then apply and blend it onto the areas where the black wash was applied, and it's this step which really makes the paint job resemble steel. Then using some of the metallic tin straight out of the tube, I dab on a few small spots to give the steel some aging. This makes it look like the sword has been dinged on armor or such to remove the oxidation level and expose the fresh steel underneath. This is why I'm only applying it to the edges and high points because these are the areas most likely to bang against things. With the pommel and guard painted, I then base the grip with a burnt umber and try to keep my brush marks running the length of the grip because they'll help create the illusion of a wooden handle. Once the umber is dry, I take a clean flat-edged brush, dab it in some black, and then pounce it onto a paper towel to remove a lot of the excess paint, because I want to create a subtle dry brush down the length of the grip. The grip is a very dark black wood, but even in dark wood there is subtle variation, so I'm lightly skimming the brush down the surface to leave behind thin lines and not prominent brush marks. Then using a small round brush and the same black paint, I'm adding some heavier, thicker lines amongst the subtle dry brushing. This gives a more natural variation to the wood grain and breaks up the evenness of the brush lines. After those dry, I mix up a Van Dyke brown wash by taking some burnt umber and mixing it with some black and then thinning it with water. This thin paint can be brushed over the entire wooden grip. While this glaze layer is still wet, I take some of the chestnut and lightly brush it in spots. This breaks up the evenness of the glaze and just gives the grip more depth and realism. This is what the handle is looking like so far. It's a nice dark wood texture. I was using flat paints and I want the grip to look like polished wood, so I'll spray it with a layer of this matte clear coat. It'll give it a bit of a shine while simultaneously protecting it from damage from handling the sword. For the finishing accents on the handle, I'm using this antique gold. This gets applied to the 7-pointed star, this small band on the top of the pommel, this band underneath, on this thin band at the bottom of the grip, and on the small domes on the guard. Finally, I'm using this very fine brush. Come on, come into focus. There we go. I'm using it with the thinned black paint to create some very subtle shadowing around the base of the domes on the guard, to make it look like these have been inserted into the steel. Alright, with the grip painted and dry, now it's down to the blade, and to paint that, I'm going to use this metallic silver. The gloss black will help it pop, and since it's a metallic, it has a higher tendency to try to run, so build up thin layers until the entire blade is covered. I ended up applying 3 thin layers to get the complete coverage, and the blade looks like this: super clean, shiny, and reflective. And Sir Duncan the Tall Sword is finished. I think the thing I really like about the design is how it is actually really pretty simple. Nothing too grand or ornate, which is befitting a hedge knight, but at the same time, there is a richness to the simplicity, with a nod to the 7 in the pommel, to the deep rich wood grip, to the subtle inlay buttons on the guard. I really had fun making this sword, and I'm looking forward to seeing Duncan wield the real one in the show. Let me know what your thoughts are for the Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, and if you'll be watching. If you want to make your own sword, a link to the files is in the below description. I hope you enjoyed this build. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, share it with all your friends and family, subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you next time. Have a great day. And remember, if you are building any of my builds or using any of my templates, feel free and tag me at Haas of Props on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok, because I would really like to see your fantastic work. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.